have to consider, if we're going to look at tissue providers and look at their perspective on these topics, what role then do they or should they play in governing policy and practice? What role also do they play in shaping the global tissue economies? Do we actually want tissue providers to take a very active role in setting the price, if you like, and setting the terms, the negotiating the deals for the exchange of tissue? And in the field of reproductive technologies, there's been a lot of concern about reproductive tourism, patients going around the world trying to get treatment under favourable conditions. But as Jeremy has already alluded to, we also need to think about the research tourism, how we as researchers move around the world to do work under favourable conditions. Okay, so finally, just to end, and by returning to that original question that I asked, is the UK a route map or a source of cautionary tales? It's very clearly the case that it's not a simple template. And what we really need, if we are to understand the full socio-cultural context of human embryonic stem cell science, and indeed stem cell science overall, is that we do need to go to both ends of the spectrum. We need to look at the translation spectrum, as Jeremy has done. We also need to look at the beginnings to say, well, where does the tissue come from? And we need to see eggs and embryos not as single universal moral entities or indeed single universal biological entities, but as contextually dependent, culturally identified entities. Thank you.
This is the most work Jeremy Sugarman's done in 10 years, I think. Thank you. So, I'm loud. So, thank you for having me here, to the organizers. Thanks in particular to the irrepressible Bernie Siegel. And what I'm going to try to do for the next 5 seconds or so, the time remaining, is to talk to you about some of the larger ethical and philosophical issues. I'm going to start by reminding you of some of the history, how we got where we are, say just a couple of words about the NIH guidelines, some of the favorable and unfavorable views of the guidelines so far, problems in domestic U.S. and global harmonization of work in stem cell biology, some ongoing philosophical divides that we can discern around the world. I want to say a couple of words about some sensitive issues on the horizon, particularly having to do with iPS cells and chimeras, as Jeremy mentioned. And then, if time remaining, I will tell you the meaning of life. Maybe I'll just skip to that now. No, I'm going to make you wait for that. So the general point here is, this is who said it better than Vito Corleone? How did things ever get so far? The general point that I want to make in the next few minutes is that really the global debates about human embryonic stem cells from the ethical and philosophical standpoints, this debate over the last dozen years is really a case study in some larger problems that we've had in trying to decide over the last couple of hundred years about where the life sciences are taking us. And I think that there's been an acceleration in breakthroughs in the life sciences that are of more and more concern to more and more people across philosophical, ideological, political differences. I want to say something about that in a few minutes. I don't think I need to walk you through each of the images in this slide. If I can see you over the lights, all of you look to me like you had come to consciousness by 1996. The same is not true of my Penn freshmen, many of whom at 18 years old in 1996 were barely aware of themselves. But the general point is that there's never been, and for various reasons, because of the intensity of the cloning issue, and it started with Dolly, and the strangeness of isolating human embryonic stem cells for the first time in 98, the 24-hour news cycle in the United States, the globalization of news and information through the web and the internet. For many reasons, the last dozen years have taken us through an absolutely, I think, unprecedented discussion and controversy about where biology is leading human beings. It was to a very great extent as a result of President Bush's policy, the announced on August 9th, 2001, that the scientific community decided to develop in the United States at least its own guidelines for human embryonic stem cell research, because it was appreciated that the President's position did not affect the use of human embryonic stem cells or the derivation of stem cells from embryos that was paid for with state funds, as in the case of California and Maryland, or with private funds. And I have to say, and I apologize, part of this talk is U.S.-centric, but our colleagues from around the world know that this is a problem we have in the U.S., to be a little bit egocentric. The national academies don't like to get into politics. They much prefer to talk about technical matters that don't take them in the political realm. I was not part of the decision to get into this project, though I was co-chair of the committee that did this report and made these recommendations. And I think it must have been very difficult for the President of the Academies to decide to do this. There are also, as many of you know, amendments to these guidelines in the following years. The ISSCR, as Jeremy mentioned, also developed its own guidelines for human ES-cell research, published in 2006. And I think the area that Jeremy started to talk about concerning clinical research with stem cells, with very potent stem cells, not just embryonic, but pluripotent and totipotent stem cells, is an area we haven't talked about as much. And frankly, coming from the University of Pennsylvania, you know, probably many of the Americans at least know, that we had a death in a gene transfer study about a dozen years ago that those of us who are interested in promoting stem cell research and clinical trials see as a shadow, and that clearly is not something we want to repeat. Great prudence and care is going to be required, I think, to move ahead with clinical trials. So, as you know, just a few months ago in March, President Obama announced that he was basically changing the period during which you could have embryonic stem cell lines that have been derived eligible for NIH support. It was quite remarkable. Only in Washington could you have a lot of pundits criticizing a presidential policy before there was one. So after the President's news conference, the next weekend, we were treated to a round of critiques of a policy, but in fact the President said in this executive order that the NIH would have to come up with guidelines according to certain criteria that he talked about in his statement. And when the NIH final guidelines came out, July 7th, just a couple of months ago, there was remarkably little criticism from many of those same pundits. These are actually very cautious, in my view, very, very prudent guidelines, a place to start, maybe not where we finish, but certainly an appropriate place to start, and I think one that is compatible with the vast majority of the American people. The interesting thing is that, at least in the United States, for the last 7 years, people who have been asked about this, about whether human embryonic stem cell research should go forward, the survey data has been remarkably consistent. Every time that they're asked, 60 to 70% of Americans approve of moving forward, and I think that what President Obama has done is essentially compatible with what most Americans feel should be the case. I know you're going to have the opportunity to sit in with experts in different meetings after this panel who will talk more about the details of the NIH final guidelines. There is one bit of somewhat emerging news today. The NIH named a panel of scientists, ethicists, who will review the hundreds of lines that were derived from embryos donated before July 7th, 2009, and lines from around the world, to see if they comport with the spirit, with the essence of the NIH final guidelines. And that group will be chaired by a well-known ethicist, geneticist, physician at the University of Arizona named Jeff Botkin. So what's going to happen now is that these many lines that were derived before July 7th, 2009 are going to be reviewed. There are essentially, I guess,